In the quiet, tree-lined streets of Maplewood, where the houses stood like silent sentinels of middle-class dreams, my family and I lived what seemed to be a picture-perfect life. My name is Jack, a 43-year-old logistics manager. My wife, Linda, 40, used to be the heart and soul of our home. We had been married for nearly 15 years, and our two daughters, Sarah, 13, and Lizzie, 11, were our pride and joy. Linda had chosen to be a stay-at-home mom, dedicating herself to raising our girls and managing our household. Our home, a charming two-story house with a picket fence, was the envy of our friends and neighbors. It was the place where Linda's laughter echoed through the halls and where the aroma of her homemade meals filled the air. Life was good. Or at least, that's what I believed. Maplewood was a small town, the kind where everyone knew everyone else. Our lives were intertwined with those of our neighbors. We hosted barbecues in the summer, attended PTA meetings together, and shared countless cups of coffee while discussing the latest happenings in our community. Our social circle was tight-knit, and Linda, with her warm personality and keen sense of humor, was at the center of it all. In the evenings, after a long day at work, I would come home to the comforting routine of family dinners, homework sessions, and bedtime stories. Linda and I would often sit on the porch, enjoying the tranquility of our neighborhood, while the girls played in the yard. We talked about our dreams, our plans for the future, and the little things that made life beautiful. But beneath the surface of this idyllic life, cracks were beginning to form. Linda's behavior had started to change subtly. She seemed distant, preoccupied, and there were moments when her warmth seemed to be replaced by a cold, almost indifferent demeanor. I tried to dismiss these thoughts, attributing them to the stresses of everyday life. Little did I know these were the early signs of a storm that was about to upend our lives forever. It started with the little things, the subtle shifts that seemed insignificant at first but gradually became impossible to ignore. Linda, once so attentive and involved, began to drift away emotionally. Our conversations, once filled with shared dreams and laughter, grew sparse and stilted. She spent more time on her phone, and her screen would light up with messages late into the night. Whenever I asked who she was texting, she would brush it off with a casual, "Just a friend." I wanted to believe her. Trust had always been a cornerstone of our relationship, and the thought of doubting her felt like a betrayal of that trust. But the changes in her behavior were hard to overlook. She started dressing differently, wearing clothes that were more revealing than her usual style. Her makeup, once reserved for special occasions, became a daily routine, and she started going out more frequently, claiming she needed time to herself. The real turning point came one Saturday evening. Linda had planned a night out with some friends, something she hadn't done in years. I encouraged her, thinking it would be good for her to relax and unwind. But as the night wore on, my anxiety grew. She didn't return until well past midnight, her face flushed and her breath smelling of alcohol. She stumbled through the door, and when I asked how her night was, she gave me a vague, almost dismissive answer. A gnawing feeling of unease settled in my gut. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. But the doubts persisted, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. The next day, as I was tidying up the living room, I found a receipt from a restaurant we never visited, tucked into the pocket of her coat. It was dated the previous night, and the bill was for 2 people. I confronted her about it, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Linda, I found this receipt in your coat pocket. You didn't mention going to this restaurant last night." She looked at me with a mixture of irritation and indifference. "Oh, that. It was just a spontaneous decision. I bumped into an old friend and we decided to grab a bite to eat." "An old friend?" I echoed, feeling a pang of jealousy and suspicion. "Who?" "Just someone from high school. You wouldn't know him," she replied casually, brushing past me to head upstairs. It wasn't just the nights out or the mysterious restaurant receipt. Linda's phone became another source of suspicion. She started guarding it closely, always taking it with her, even to the bathroom. Whenever a message came through, she would angle the screen away from me, her fingers moving quickly to respond before I could catch a glimpse. When I tried to ask her about it, she would roll her eyes and accuse me of being controlling. Despite my best efforts to maintain our usual routine, the tension was palpable. I could sense that something was fundamentally wrong, but without concrete evidence, I felt trapped in a limbo of doubt and suspicion. The love and trust that had once defined our marriage were slowly being eroded by an invisible force, and I felt powerless to stop it. My suspicions reached a breaking point one night when Linda received a phone call after dinner. She glanced at the caller ID, her expression tightening for a split second before she stood up and walked out of the room to take the call in private. I followed her with my eyes, my heart pounding in my chest. Moments later, I heard her laughter, a sound that had become increasingly rare in our interactions. I decided I couldn't ignore it any longer. As she chatted away in the kitchen, I quietly picked up our home phone and pressed the mute button. Holding my breath, I listened to her conversation. The words were muffled, but the tone was unmistakable. Intimate, affectionate, and completely inappropriate for a just-a-friend conversation. My heart sank as the reality of the situation began to crystallize. Linda was hiding something from me, something that threatened to destroy the life we had built together. I knew I needed to find out the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The trust that had once been the bedrock of our marriage was now a fragile facade, and the cracks were growing wider with each passing day. The need to uncover the truth gnawed at me, relentless and consuming. I started paying closer attention to Linda's schedule, noting her comings and goings with a meticulousness that bordered on obsession. One Saturday, she told me she was going to meet a friend for lunch and would be back in a few hours. I felt a strange mix of dread and determination as I decided to follow her. I waited a few minutes after she left, then grabbed my keys and hurried out the door. Keeping a safe distance, I tailed her car through the quiet streets of Maplewood. My heart pounded as I watched her drive towards the town park, a place we often took the girls on weekends. She parked her car and got out, looking around as if expecting someone. I followed her on foot, staying hidden behind the rows of trees that lined the park. She walked briskly towards a secluded area near the old gazebo, a spot that was usually deserted during the day. My heart clenched as I saw a man already there, waiting for her. It was Chris, the same guy whose name had popped up on her phone. Linda approached him with a smile that was all too familiar, yet now felt foreign and painful. They exchanged a few words, their voices low and intimate, before she leaned in and kissed him. It wasn't just a peck on the cheek. It was a full, passionate kiss, the kind that left no room for doubt about their relationship. A red haze of anger and betrayal clouded my vision. I stepped out from behind the trees, unable to contain the rage that had been building inside me for weeks. "Linda!" I shouted, my voice cracking with a mix of fury and heartbreak. She jumped, pulling away from Chris, her face going pale as she saw me striding towards them. Chris looked startled, but his surprise quickly turned to defiance. "Jack, what are you doing here?" Linda stammered, her voice trembling. "I could ask you the same thing," I spat, my fists clenching at my sides. "But I think it's pretty damn clear, isn't it?" Chris stepped forward, trying to shield Linda. "Look, man, this isn't what it looks like," he said, his tone conciliatory. "Save it," I snapped, my voice rising. "You think I'm an idiot? I've seen enough." The next moments were a blur. Driven by a blind rage, I lunged at Chris. He tried to fend me off, but my fury gave me strength. My fist connected with his jaw, and he stumbled back, falling to the ground. Linda screamed, but I was beyond caring. All the anger, the frustration, the betrayal, I poured it all into every punch, every blow. "Jack, stop!" Linda cried, trying to pull me off him. But I shoved her away, not wanting to be touched by her. Chris groaned, trying to protect his face, but I was relentless. It was only when I saw the blood on my knuckles and heard the distant sound of someone shouting for help that I came back to my senses. I stood up, breathing heavily, looking down at Chris, who was lying on the ground, bloodied and beaten. Linda was crying, her hands covering her mouth in shock. People had started to gather, their faces a mix of horror and curiosity. Realizing the scene I had caused, I backed away, my hands shaking. You ruined everything," Linda sobbed, her voice barely audible. "No, Linda," I said, my voice cold and broken. "You did." I turned and walked away, leaving the chaos behind me. The adrenaline drained from my body, leaving me feeling hollow and numb. As I made my way back to the car, I realized that there was no going back from this. The life I thought I knew was shattered, and all that was left was the painful task of picking up the pieces. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing with the events that had just unfolded. The image of Linda kissing Chris, the feeling of my fists connecting with his face. It all replayed in my head like a nightmare on a loop. When I pulled into our driveway, I just sat in the car for a few minutes, trying to collect myself. But there was no escaping the reality of what had happened. I had to face it head on. Linda wasn't home when I walked through the door. I wasn't sure if she was still at the park or had gone somewhere else to avoid the inevitable confrontation. I paced the living room, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins, making it impossible to sit still. Finally, the sound of the front door opening jolted me out of my thoughts. Linda stepped inside, her face tear-streaked and pale. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it, her eyes red from crying. "We need to talk," I said, my voice sounding more composed than I felt. "Jack, I'm so sorry," she began, but I cut her off. "Sorry?" I spat, the anger flaring up again. "You're sorry? You've been lying to me, cheating on me, and you think sorry is going to fix this?" She flinched at my words, but she quickly gathered herself. "It's not what you think. Chris and I. It was a mistake. I didn't mean for it to happen." "A mistake?" I echoed, incredulous. "Linda, you've been seeing him behind my back for months. That's not a mistake. That's a choice." She stepped forward, her hands outstretched as if to touch me, but I recoiled. "Jack, please. I know I've hurt you, but we can work through this. We can go to counseling, fix our marriage." I shook my head, the pain in my chest almost unbearable. "How can you say that? How can you even suggest that after what you've done?" Tears streamed down her face as she tried to explain herself. "I was lonely, Jack. You were always at work, and I felt neglected. Chris was there, and it just happened." "Don't you dare blame this on me!" I snapped, my voice rising. "I've been working my ass off to provide for this family, to give you and the girls everything you need. And this is how you repay me?" Linda sobbed, but there was a flicker of defiance in her eyes. "You don't understand, Jack. You've never understood. I needed more than just financial support. I needed you." "Don't turn this around on me," I said, my voice cold. "You made your choice. You destroyed our family." The room fell silent, the weight of our words hanging heavy in the air. I could see the realization dawn on her face, that this wasn't something we could simply talk our way out of. "What do you want from me, Jack?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What can I do to make this right?" "There's nothing you can do," I replied, my voice flat. "It's too late for that. I've already spoken to a lawyer. I'm filing for divorce, and I'm going to fight for full custody of Sarah and Lizzie." Her eyes widened in shock. "You can't do that! You can't take my children away from me!" "They need stability," I said, my resolve hardening. "And right now, you're not capable of providing that." She sank to the floor, her body shaking with sobs. "Jack, please, don't do this. Don't take them away from me." I looked at her, feeling a mix of anger, sadness, and a strange sense of detachment. This was the woman I had loved, the mother of my children, but now she felt like a stranger. "You did this, Linda, not me." I turned and walked away, leaving her sobbing on the floor. I went upstairs to the bedroom we once shared, now feeling like a place of betrayal. I grabbed a suitcase and began packing my things. I couldn't stay in this house any longer, not after everything that had happened. As I packed, I heard Linda's voice from downstairs, crying out for me, pleading for another chance. But her words fell on deaf ears. The trust, the love, it was all gone. All that was left was the painful task of moving on, of finding a way to rebuild my life without her. I took one last look around the bedroom, the memories of happier times haunting me, before I closed the suitcase and walked out. The house felt empty, hollow, as if the very soul of it had been stripped away. As I descended the stairs, Linda was still there, her eyes swollen and red, her expression one of desperation. "Please, Jack," she whispered. "Don't leave me." But I didn't respond. I couldn't. I walked past her, out the front door, and into a future that was uncertain and filled with pain. But it was a future where I could begin to heal, where I could start anew. The confrontation had been brutal, the words cutting deep. But it was necessary. The chapter of my life with Linda was over, and it was time to face the next one, no matter how daunting it seemed. In the days following our confrontation, I moved into a small apartment on the other side of town. It wasn't much, but it was mine, a place where I could start to piece together my shattered life. I spent most of my time sorting through the logistics of the impending divorce, talking to lawyers, and trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy for Sarah and Lizzie. But beneath the surface, a storm of anger and betrayal raged. Every quiet moment was filled with thoughts of Linda and Chris, their betrayal, and the life I thought I had. It wasn't enough to just leave. I needed to do something more, to make them feel a fraction of the pain they had caused me. I started by digging into Chris's life. It wasn't hard to find information about him. Social media profiles, mutual friends, and a bit of internet sleuthing gave me everything I needed. Chris was married, with a wife and 2 young children. His wife, Jessica, was completely unaware of his affair with Linda. Fueled by a sense of righteous anger, I decided to expose Chris for who he really was. I gathered all the evidence I had. Screenshots of text messages, photos, and dates of their meetings. I compiled everything into a neat, damning package and sent it anonymously to Jessica. I didn't include any explanations, just the raw truth. I knew it would devastate her, but I also knew she deserved to know. A few days later, I received a call from an unknown number. It was Jessica. Her voice was trembling, filled with a mix of confusion and pain. "Who are you?" she demanded. "Why did you send me this?" "My name is Jack," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Linda is my wife. Or rather, she was, until I found out about her affair with Chris. I thought you deserved to know the truth." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. "I don't know what to say. I had no idea." "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it. "I know this is going to be hard, but you deserve better than this." We spoke for a while longer, sharing our stories, our pain. It was strange, finding solace in a stranger who was going through the same turmoil. But it also felt right, like we were both taking the first steps toward reclaiming our lives. The next part of my plan involved Linda. I knew that simply exposing her affair wasn't enough. She needed to understand the gravity of what she had done, to feel the consequences of her actions. I contacted her employer, explaining the situation and providing the evidence of her misconduct. It was a risky move, but I was beyond caring. Linda had betrayed our family, and she needed to face the fallout. The news spread quickly in our small town. Whispers and rumors circulated, and Linda's pristine reputation began to crumble. Friends who had once admired her now looked at her with disdain, and her social circles began to close in on her. She tried to deny everything at first, but the evidence was too overwhelming. One evening, as I was settling into my new apartment, I received a call from Linda. Her voice was a mix of anger and desperation. "Jack, what the hell are you doing? You've ruined my life." "Your life?" I echoed, my voice cold. "You mean like how you ruined ours?" "This is different," she insisted. "You didn't have to drag everyone into this." "You dragged everyone into this the moment you decided to cheat," I replied. "Now you're just facing the consequences." She screamed at me, a torrent of curses and accusations, but I simply hung up. Her words couldn't hurt me anymore. I had made my point, and now it was time to move on. The final act of my revenge was more personal. I knew Linda would never fully understand the pain she had caused unless she experienced it herself. I began dating again, not out of a desire for a relationship, but to make a statement. I posted pictures of myself with other women on social media, making sure Linda would see them. Each post was a reminder that I was moving on, that I was rebuilding my life without her. It didn't take long for Linda to reach out again. This time, her tone was different. Less angry, more pleading. "Jack, please, can we talk? I miss you. I miss our family." I met her at a local coffee shop, our conversation strained and awkward. She looked tired, worn down by the scandal and the isolation. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," she said, her voice soft. "I know I made a terrible mistake, but can't we find a way to move past this?" I shook my head, the anger still simmering just beneath the surface. "You can't undo what you did, Linda. You broke something that can't be fixed." "But what about the girls?" she asked, her eyes pleading. "They need their parents together." "The girls need stability," I replied. "And right now that means living separately. I'll always be their father, but I can't be your husband anymore." She cried, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for her. But then I remembered the betrayal, the lies, and the pain she had caused. My resolve hardened. This was the path I had chosen, and there was no turning back. As I walked away from the coffee shop, I felt a sense of closure. The revenge had been harsh, but it had also been necessary. Linda and Chris had both paid the price for their betrayal, and I could finally begin to move forward. It wasn't a happy ending, but it was an ending nonetheless. And sometimes, that's all you can hope for. The divorce proceedings were a grueling emotional ordeal that stretched over several months. Both Linda and I had our lawyers, and each hearing felt like another battle in a war that neither of us had wanted, but were now forced to fight. The courtroom became the stage where the remnants of our shattered marriage were laid bare for all to see. Linda's lawyer was aggressive, trying to paint her as the victim of a neglectful husband who had driven her into the arms of another man. My lawyer, Mr. Davis, countered with the evidence of her affair, emphasizing the betrayal and the impact it had on our family. The testimonies were painful, dredging up memories and emotions I would have preferred to leave buried. The most difficult part was the discussion of custody. Sarah and Lizzie were my top priority, and I was determined to provide them with the stability they needed. Linda, despite everything, fought fiercely for joint custody. She argued that the girls needed their mother as much as their father, and while I couldn't disagree with that, I was wary of the environment she could provide given her recent actions. During one particularly tense hearing, Linda took the stand. She spoke about her loneliness, her feelings of abandonment, and how she had felt pushed into the affair. Her tears flowed freely, and for a moment, I almost felt pity for her. But then I remembered the pain and betrayal, and any sympathy I might have felt was overshadowed by the need to protect my daughters. When it was my turn, I spoke about the trust that had been shattered, the nights spent wondering where Linda was, and the fear that our daughters would be caught in the middle of our broken marriage. I presented a calm exterior, but inside, I was a storm of emotions, fighting to keep my composure for the sake of my case. The judge listened carefully to both sides, taking into account the evidence, the testimonies, and the welfare of Sarah and Lizzie. When the final ruling came, it was a bittersweet victory. I was granted primary custody, with Linda receiving visitation rights. The judge emphasized the importance of co-parenting and encouraged us to work together for the sake of our children. After the ruling, Linda and I had a private meeting with our lawyers. The atmosphere was tense, but there was also a sense of finality. We discussed the logistics of the custody arrangement, the division of assets, and the financial support Linda would need to start anew. It was a stark contrast to the life we had once dreamed of, but it was the reality we now had to face. Leaving the courthouse, I felt a mix of relief and sadness. The battle was over, but the scars it left behind would take a long time to heal. I looked at Linda, standing on the steps with a distant expression, and for a moment, I wondered if things could have been different. But that thought quickly passed. There was no changing the past, only moving forward. Sarah and Lizzie took the news with a resilience that surprised me. They had been through so much, yet they showed a maturity beyond their years. We talked about the new arrangements, and I reassured them that, no matter what, both their parents loved them deeply. They were the most important part of this entire process, and I was determined to make sure they felt secure and loved. The first few weeks after the trial were a period of adjustment. The girls spent weekends with Linda, and I did my best to create a stable, loving environment for them at home. It wasn't easy, and there were moments of doubt and frustration, but slowly, we began to find our rhythm. Linda and I communicated through a co-parenting app, keeping our interactions civil and focused on the girls. It was a far cry from the warmth and intimacy we once shared, but it was necessary. Every drop-off and pickup was a reminder of what had been lost, but also of the new life we were building. One evening, after the girls had gone to bed, I sat in the living room, reflecting on everything that had happened. The house was quiet, the weight of the past month settling over me like a heavy blanket. I thought about the trial, the arguments, and the final ruling. It had been a long and painful journey, but we had come through it. I realized that, despite the anger and betrayal, there was still a part of me that wished Linda well. She had been a part of my life for so long, and though our marriage had ended, she was still the mother of my children. I hoped she would find her own path to healing and happiness, just as I was trying to find mine. The trial had been a crucible, a test of endurance and resilience. It had forced me to confront my pain, to fight for my daughters, and to redefine my future. But it had also shown me that I was stronger than I had ever realized. The road ahead was still uncertain, but I was ready to face it, one step at a time. With the trial behind us and the custody arrangements settled, life began to take on a new rhythm. Each day was a step away from the chaos and pain of the past, and a step toward healing and rebuilding. The girls adapted quickly to our new routine, finding comfort in the stability I worked hard to provide. Their laughter, their joy, became my anchors. My relationship with Sarah and Lizzie grew stronger. Without the constant tension that had plagued our home, we found new ways to connect. Weekends were filled with activities, trips to the park, movie nights, and board games. I even started helping out with their school projects, something I hadn't had time for before. It felt good to be present, to be the father they needed. One evening, as we were making dinner together, Sarah looked up at me and said, "Dad, you seem happier." Her words hit me hard, a poignant reminder of how far we had come. I smiled at her, ruffling her hair. "I am, sweetheart, and it's all because of you and Lizzie." Linda's visits with the girls were civil, and over time, we managed to find a way to co-parent effectively. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments of tension, but we kept our focus on what mattered most, Sarah and Lizzie's well-being. The girls spent every other weekend with Linda, and I used that time to take care of myself, to reflect and grow. One Saturday, while the girls were with Linda, I decided to revisit some old hobbies I'd neglected over the years. Photography had always been a passion of mine, and I dusted off my old camera and went for a walk around Maplewood. Capturing the beauty of our town through the lens was therapeutic, a reminder that life still held moments of joy and wonder. During one of these photo walks, I ran into Jenna, an old friend from high school. We hadn't seen each other in years, and it was a pleasant surprise to reconnect. We chatted about old times, our lives since then, and eventually, the conversation turned to more personal topics. I told her about the divorce, the trial, and the challenges of starting over. Jenna listened with empathy and shared her own story of overcoming a difficult breakup. There was a mutual understanding between us, a shared recognition of the resilience it took to rebuild after a significant loss. We exchanged numbers, promising to keep in touch. As weeks turned into months, Jenna and I started spending more time together. We would meet for coffee, go for walks, and talk about everything under the sun. It was refreshing to have someone who understood, someone who made me laugh and feel at ease. Our friendship slowly blossomed into something more, and I found myself looking forward to our time together. One evening, after a particularly enjoyable dinner, Jenna looked at me and said, "Jack, you deserve to be happy. You've been through so much, and it's time you allowed yourself to move on." Her words resonated deeply, and for the first time I felt ready to embrace the future. We started dating officially, and Jenna quickly became a cherished part of my life. She met Sarah and Lizzie, and her warmth and kindness won them over almost instantly. Seeing them bond with her was a relief and a joy. It felt like the pieces of my life were finally coming together. Reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this point, I realized how much I had grown. The betrayal, the anger, and the trial had been defining moments, but they didn't define me. They were chapters in my story, but they weren't the end. I had found the strength to rebuild, to create a new life filled with love and hope. One sunny afternoon, as we sat in the park watching Sarah and Lizzie play, Jenna turned to me and said, "You know, life has a way of surprising us. Sometimes the hardest paths lead to the most beautiful destinations." I smiled, taking her hand in mine. "You're right, Jenna, and I'm grateful for every step that led me here." As the seasons changed, so did my outlook on life. I had moved on from the betrayal and the pain, finding happiness in the simplest of moments. My relationship with Jenna continued to grow, and my bond with Sarah and Lizzie strengthened each day. Life after Linda was not just about surviving, it was about thriving. It was about finding joy in the everyday, about embracing new opportunities, and about recognizing my own worth. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had also been transformative. In the end, I learned that betrayal doesn't define you. How you respond to it does. I chose to rebuild, to find happiness, and to create a life that was not just a reaction to the past, but a celebration of the future. As I looked at Jenna and my daughters, I knew that the future was bright. The shadows of the past had finally receded, and in their place was a world full of possibilities. I had found love, happiness, and most importantly, myself. And so, with the sun setting on another beautiful day in Maplewood, I felt a deep sense of peace. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was also filled with hope. And that, I realized, was the most beautiful part of all.